Hi everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Nige, also known as Levanterman, and I'm best known for taking busy, vibrant shots such as these. But just before we get started, I'll just introduce myself. You might have seen me in previous years at the photography show, speaking for Canon or the show itself. And during this time, I've been immensely lucky to work with some major brands, which has been a very exciting journey. But today, I'm here to talk about being unique. As you're all aware, there are so many factors to take into account when taking a picture, whether that's camera mode or which lens do I use, what's the lighting, the depth of field. So today, I'd like to walk you through some of the photographs I've taken and share with you my thought process leading up to these photographs. Some of the examples might have been planned shots or spontaneous shots, or a client shoot, or an extremely planned shot that maybe didn't go to plan, and how I adjusted to the conditions and changed the approach to come out with something totally different. I absolutely do love taking time lapses, and time lapses are really interesting because the more you get into time lapsing, the more you learn about photography. You learn a lot from taking the same photograph over and over again with the changing light conditions or focal point. So I really encourage you to explore time-lapse photography, and we'll talk a little bit about it today. But just before we get started, I'd like to show you a 90-second video to demonstrate exactly what we're going to be talking about. And here it is. There you go, and I hope you enjoyed that. You may have noticed a lot of ND filter usage throughout that video, and I'm going to talk to you about how I use ND filters. But before I do, I thought I couldn't assume that you'd used them before. So here's a crash course on how to get started. The first thing you need to do is to remove your lens hood and your lens cap. Typically, an ND filter attaches to your lens using a mounting ring, and you need to know the size. There's a couple of quick ways of finding out the size. One is you look on the back of the lens cap where it tells you the diameter of the lens, or secondly, you can actually look on the end of the lens and usually it tells you there somewhere around the rim. So once you've identified what size you need, just screw the mounting ring on the ND lens. Another filter you might want to consider is a circular polarization filter. Just look at the effect it has of removing the sun glare from the camera. And this also applies to water surfaces and glass. You vary the amount of polarization that's been applied by simply rotating the filter. And lastly, make sure you clean your camera lens and also your filter. Even if they look clean, clean them, because I guarantee you they're not clean. And dust particles will show up on your shot when you download the camera. Okay, so now we're ready to set the camera up. First thing we'll do is put the camera into manual mode and then adjust the aperture and the shutter until the EV meter is on 0. This will give us the optimal shot. So take a note of the shutter setting and then head over to the Lee Filters app. Lee Filters do a few apps depending on which filters you have. So the first thing you need to do is put your shutter speed on the left hand dial. In this case that's 1/25 of a second. And then head up to the top of the app. Select which ND filter you're using from the top, and in this case we've chosen an ND10, which gives us an exposure time of 40 seconds. Now we go back to our camera, and because it's over 30 seconds exposure, we use the bulb mode. Set 40 seconds, same aperture, same ISO, and if you don't have a bulb timer in your camera, you can use the built-in timer in the Lee Filters app. Just before we take a look at the shot with the ND filter, let's just have a quick look at the before shot. You can see there's ripples on the water from the breeze. The castle reflection is okay, but not too vivid, and the clouds in the sky are pretty static. Now let's transition over to the shot we've just taken, at 40-second exposure with an ND10. As you can see, there's quite a difference. The surface of the water where we saw the wind is much smoother. The reflection of the castle is silky smooth. However, this is just a personal preference. Up in the top left corner you can see some movement from the breeze. Personally, I don't like movement which creates a slight blur like this. I like it to be nice and crispy. Foreground movement can be quite distracting to the eye and really take your eye away from the shot. Whilst I was setting up the ND filter, I was pretty fortunate this lady came to sit down and read her book, which made a perfect addition to the photo. Okay, I hope this little tutorial helped. Now we can dive into the talk, where I'll be showing you various ways on how to use ND filters to create different effects. Okay, let's talk about our first photograph. I'd like to talk about the concept of simply rotating a photograph to achieve different effects. This is a photograph of the northbound Bakerloo line at Waterloo railway station in London. So here we have a combination of lead-in lines and a photo rotation. But let's just have a look at this platform in a normal view and then talk about how it ended up looking like this. So I returned to the exact spot where I took the photo to try and explain what I saw there. The first thing that attracted me to this platform was the piano-type keys pattern across the platform, and then the long curvature of the platform as well. But as you can imagine, it's a really busy railway station, and there's things getting in the way like trains and people. So let's take a look at the platform from another angle. Here you can see it's still quite congested, and the adverts on the wall, the billboards, they're all very mixed colours and not very consistent, which it kind of draws your eye away from the actual photograph. And there's a couple of people in the photograph too, and for this particular photo I wanted an absolutely empty platform. So I was pretty lucky the day I actually took the photograph. It was around about 8 AM on a Saturday morning, really quiet. So here is the original photograph, and as you can see it is really quiet. There's a couple of people right in the far distance of the platform. But also on this particular day I got really lucky with the billboards on the wall. Apart from the advert on the right, the rest of them are quite consistent with the colours of the Bakerloo line. And this gave me something to work with. So I took the shot. When I downloaded the shot onto my computer, I was pleased with the lead-in lines, the curvature of the platform, and a kind of symmetry to the photograph as well, but it just wasn't enough, so I started playing around with the edit. By rotating the photograph, I found that the lights on the ceiling lined up with one corner, and the mind the gap and the lines of the platform lined up with the other. So I created some vignette and some editing to try and get the person viewing the photograph to read the mind the gap first, as that's very familiar, and draw the eye in from the edge of the photograph to the middle, and then that moment of realization like, oh, what am I looking at exactly here? That's the kind of effect I wanted to achieve. And you can see the consistent colour scheme on the billboards on the wall really helped pull this photograph together, because if those billboards were really just random bright coloured adverts, then it really wouldn't have worked at all. Okay, I hope you liked that shot. It was pretty popular on social media and got a lot of responses about people twisting and turning their neck to try and figure out what it was. So let's move on. And the Bakerloo line location leads me perfectly onto the next piece of content that I wanted to share with you. Just take a look at this. Have you ever thought about using an ND filter inside, or in this case, underground? I wanted to create some motion blur on the train, but it was just too light down there on the station platform. So I tried using the 0.9 ND filter. It's just enough to create the blur, and then turn it into an endless cinematograph to create this effect. And also, just take a look at the billboards on the wall here. These wouldn't have worked in the previous example. I wanted to share this with you just to show what can be achieved at the exact same location to the previous example, but the resulting content is 100% different. So do try and think outside the box and really push your boundaries to see what you come up with. Before we go any further, I'd just like to talk a little bit more in depth about the use of ND filters. I run long exposure photography workshops, and that's daytime and nighttime, and a common question is, exactly how long is the exposure I should be using. What I'd like to try and demonstrate to you now is that there isn't a direct answer to this, and there's many factors that you need to take into account to achieve the result you had in mind. And in this case, how fast is the traffic travelling, or how fast are the clouds moving, or how light is it, or how dark is it? And also, what sort of effect are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve long traffic trails or short traffic trails? So let me take you through this demonstration that I set up on a nearby motorway bridge that may not have been too popular with the drivers underneath. So as you can see, I set up 3 cameras. The 2 cameras on the right have ND filters and the camera on the left does not. What I wanted to try and demonstrate is the exact same shot taken with different filters or no filter. I made a small time lapse just so you can see the comparison. All the video clips I'm about to show you were taken with the same interval of 5 seconds. The video on the top is the camera with no ND filter, and you can clearly see each vehicle individually with only a slight bit of vehicle blur from the movement in the foreground. But the video itself looks almost jerky due to the lack of motion blur. Now let's take a look at the bottom example, which has a slightly slower shutter speed because we're using an ND6 filter. So now when you look at the cars, there's plenty of motion blur. It's much smoother and pleasing to the eye to look at. And also compare the clouds between the top and the bottom version. The clouds are also much smoother. And the point at which you can make out each car individually has moved further back into the shot. Okay, so both these examples are taken with an ND6 filter. However, the top example is with a 0.4 shutter speed and the bottom with a 1 second shutter speed. So looking at the top example, the traffic has nice motion blur, but when you look at the bottom example, the cars and vehicles, you can't even make out the vehicles individually, and actually they're almost disappearing. So it's possibly a little bit too long shutter speed here. And quickly, I'd just like to demonstrate the use of a gradient filter. Just compare the skies between the top and the bottom. The top sky is a little bit blown out on the left, but the bottom sky has a lot more depth of blue colour and not quite so blown out on the left. So it brings out a fuller picture and allows you to expose correctly for the subject, and in this case that's the road. Let's just take a look at all the examples put together, starting in the top left with the 1 second exposure. As we mentioned earlier, the cars are not quite visible, so slightly too long shutter speed. Then the 0.4 second, personally I quite like the traffic here. It's got about 50% blur, and then you can make out the vehicles in the far distance. In the bottom left, the 2.5 second soft gradient, the sky is better, but 2.5 seconds, the cars are really invisible, they're just streaks. And in the bottom right hand corner, no ND filter at all. Let's move on. So my optimal choice here would be the soft gradient filter for the sky and the 0.4 second ND6 for the traffic. So everything we've just spoken about with the Lee Filters app during the day, the same technique absolutely applies to nighttime or low light level conditions. And seen here, you can use an ND filter during low light if you want to induce some longer trails that wouldn't be possible without an ND filter. And typically during a sunset, the light would fall away quite rapidly and you wouldn't need a filter. So let's very quickly go through a handful of examples and just explain the differences. So these examples are without an ND filter. So this is a 30-mile-an-hour zone within a town, and at 25 seconds exposure you can see the long traffic trails that pretty much go from front to back of the shot, and you can't make out the vehicles at all. 15 seconds, you can see there wasn't time for the vehicle travelling maybe up to 30 miles an hour to reach the back of the shot, so the trails aren't as long. But as we go down to 8 seconds, now you can see the outline of people walking down the pavement and also make out a vehicle in the traffic trail. But take a look at this one. At 6 seconds, there is a trail from front to back, but as it turned out, it's 2 vehicles and you can just see the join of the trails in the middle of the shot with an indicator flashing. At 4 seconds, the outline of the person on the pavement is clearly visible. There aren't multiple trails now, and also the traffic trail is a lot shorter. At 3.2 seconds, multiple people are clearly visible on the pavement, and also you can make out the outline of the vehicle. And a very similar result at 2.5 seconds. But at 1 second, the traffic trails are very small, and also you can see multiple vehicles. But do play around with exposure times and see which result you prefer. I can't stress to you enough how important it is to have a fast memory card. If your camera can't write the photographs it's taking to the card fast enough, then it'll start buffering up, and when it buffers up, that means you can't take a photograph, so you have to wait. So to improve the chances of you getting the shot, it's imperative that you invest in a decent, fast memory card. For example, here are the red arrows at the RAF 100 a few years ago, and I wanted to try and get them flying past the London Eye. This photograph was taken from the Marriott County Hall Hotel, who kindly let me stand on their balcony to take this photograph. And I knew the red arrows were coming from the right hand side, but I didn't know the altitude, and I didn't know the focus point, so I had to be ready. So I put my camera into a very high shutter speed, but also made sure that the camera was set to write to the CF card and not the SD card, as CF cards have a slightly higher write speed. I wanted to be sure that I'd take as many photographs as I could in a very short burst. Here's another example, and this is totally a one-shot deal. There's no second take on such photos like this. The point I'm trying to get across here is, again, just like the ND filters, think in advance on what effect you would like to achieve from the photograph and adjust your camera settings appropriately. Make sure you have a fast memory card, and also make sure that card is selected for use on your camera. I've been using Lexar cards for many years. A great feature is that it works with my Samsung Galaxy phone. And with the Lexar card reader, I can plug it into the phone and directly download the RAWs or JPEGs into Lightroom Mobile or Snapseed. In this example, I wanted to try and show you where a planned shoot turned out to be nothing too exciting initially because of the weather and the lack of clouds. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a beautiful sight watching the sunrise over the Manhattan skyline. Here you can see from the date, it was the 1st of January on 2018, and it was around about minus 15 degrees outside, super cold. I was hoping to time-lapse an epic sunrise, but there wasn't a single cloud in the sky and really not much happening on the water either. So I decided to abort the time-lapse altogether and try something else instead. I remember when I started out using ND filters, trying to do an ND filter for sunrise can be a little bit risky, because as you know, the highlight of the colour of a sunrise and sunset can literally last just a few minutes, and if you get it wrong, you've missed it. So earlier in the talk I explained how to use the Lee Filter app to give you a recommendation of the exposure time you should be using based on the current light level. But in sunrise and sunset, the current light level changes very rapidly, especially in sunrise if you're shooting into the sun. Take into account the rising light level of sunrise, and that means reducing the exposure time recommended to you by the Lee Filters app. So what I wanted to achieve was a very long exposure, because I kid you not, there were dead ducks floating past, and there were live ducks swimming past, and also there were seagulls moving around. There were seagulls landing, and also seagulls taking off into the sky, and I didn't want any of these in the shot at all, or birds in the sky, so I really wanted to leave the exposure running for quite a few minutes. Now, taking into account the rising light level, I had to reduce the exposure time recommended. So based on the current light setting, the Lee Filter app was giving me a recommendation of an 8-minute exposure for a big stopper ND10. During a sunrise, 8 minutes the light levels would change dramatically, so if I'd taken the shot on 8 minutes, after 8 minutes the shot would have probably been quite blown out and overexposed. Next setting down was 6 minutes 40, and the next one down after that was 5 minutes 20, so I decided to go for 6 minutes instead of 8 minutes. And here is the resulting shot, and as you can see, it's quite a contrast to the time-lapse sequence that I showed you earlier. The surface of the water is silky smooth, you can't see any ducks swimming past. On top of the wood, you can't see any seagulls, you can't see any seagulls taking off or landing, and there's no seagulls in the air either. And then if you look down the left-hand side of the skyscrapers on the skyline, you can just see the reflection of the rising sun behind. All in all, it came out very well. So when you're going somewhere for a shoot, just have a think about the alternatives you could create if the weather doesn't go to plan. Okay, so now I'd just like to talk a little bit about street photography, or try and think of it as a non-static composition. Here's an example of Oxford Street in London, and as you can see, it's constantly changing. Everything's changing. So choosing the moment you take a shot is just as important as choosing a location to take the shot, because you need to combine the current location with an exact moment in time, which makes a good composition. So one day I was walking down Oxford Street and arrived in this exact location. However, it had been raining and there was a big puddle here, and it really change the composition of this view. So here's the shot, and as you can see that the puddle immediately catches your attention and pulls you into the shot. And then your eye works out where the reflection's from and then starts to look around the picture. The leading lines of the double yellow lines on the road also draw you into the picture. And then the composition works well with just as how the buses are laid out across the two lanes of the road and the people's umbrellas at this particular shot with the dreary colours. So I decided to make it black and white. And it's at this point that the photograph really came alive. Flattening the colours just made it so much more vivid and interesting to look at. And here's another shot at the exact same place. Again, it was raining, but there are no Christmas decorations, no reflections, but heavy rain in the puddle. And then a taxi really dominating the shot. So again, it changes the composition entirely, even though the location is the same. So the message here is, even if you take the same commute to work, day in, day out, keep your eyes peeled because every day the composition will be different to the previous day. And just as a closing note to this section, this photograph was taken with a mobile phone. The technology in cameras in mobile phones are moving really fast, and they really do produce some excellent quality photos. Is this the death of compact cameras? Time will tell. And that leads on nicely to using your mobile phone to capture spontaneous shots. You can configure the side button on most mobile phones to launch the camera when you double click it, so you can capture anything instantly. But when you're out and about, just keep an eye out for things that will naturally frame your photo. And in this case, there's two wooden pillars here with some lights on that enclose this quite nicely and the light hanging from above. And with this approach, trees also work very well. But here's another shot I quite like. This was taken with a fisheye lens, and you can see there's a bit of lens distortion across the bottom. But again, I wasn't too happy with the colours, so a little bit of an edit into black and white and corrected some lens distortion, brought it out really nicely with some natural framing from the tunnel arch and some leading lines from the lights on the ceiling, which draw you into the shot. When you go to a location with traffic lights, it's worth just spending a few minutes analysing the sequence of the traffic lights to see what the traffic's doing. I mean, obviously not remembering the sequence of this bunch of traffic lights, but let's just walk round the corner from Oxford Street onto Regent Street and take a look at this view and keep an eye on the traffic lights. You can see that every now and again a car stops in the right-hand lane and then traffic passes those cars on the left-hand lane, especially cars that are in the wrong lane. So by analysing the traffic lights, you can really get a well-timed photograph. And from this location, I waited for a taxi to pull in, which obviously, being London, didn't really take long at all. But I was fortunate enough that a car behind swerved out of the wrong lane to make a lovely traffic trail past the taxi. Traffic lights can create some really interesting long exposure shots. And finally, a really brief mention for Symmetry. Keep your eye out for Symmetry. They do make very interesting photographs. And that brings me to the end of the talk, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Have a think about everything we've just spoken about with filters and exposure times. But it's definitely worth playing around with exposure times because conditions vary so much: daytime, nighttime, weather, inside, outside. And to achieve the effect you want, you really need to know exactly the result you're looking for and then adjust the settings appropriately. And if you don't know what result you're looking for, play around and explore. Try some shots with filters, without filters, longer exposures or shorter exposures. So when somebody asks me about what exposure times they should be using, the answer is there is no answer, because there's so many factors that you need to take into account, but also it's personal preference. All the time lapses in this video were produced with LR time-lapse. All the photos in the time-lapse and all the photos were stored on Lexar memory cards. And all the motion time-lapses were created with Edelkrone hardware. All my filters, grads and ring adapters are all Lee filters. All my camera equipment and lenses are Canon. And all the other photographs and the behind-the-scenes content were taken with a Samsung phone, which has a most excellent camera. So much for tuning in. I really hope you found it interesting. So remember, push your boundaries, think outside the box, and whatever you come up with, it's your preference. It's all for fun.